myself and Matthew have been playing a video game over the last 7 days. The big video game, the one video game, Resident Evil Village. And this takes place shortly after Resident Evil 7. In this, you're playing as the everyman Ethan Winters again, but rather than your main goal being to try and find your wife like it was in 7, you're trying to find your baby daughter in this, and we'll leave it at that. In order to find her, you've rocked up to this nondescript village in a part of Europe where all the humans have American accents, Matthew, and the rest of them are monsters of some kind.
Yeah.
And you have to defeat 4 big bads and then a big bad in order to get your daughter Rose back. I think we're coming at this from slightly different angles, which should make for a very enjoyable discussion. But for me, this is like football team A versus football team B and the match that they would play, because this is very much a game of two halves.
Right.
First half is a Metroidvania light, or the Metroidvania light aspects of the village, which is the hub world you keep coming back to, as well as the first 2 big bads. I think that's some good survival horror. And the second half is your other 2 big bads in the conclusion of the game. That is more full-on action-packed first-person shooter. The village itself, Matthew, it's not a terribly large area, but in my view, what Capcom do with it, I think is quite good.
Yeah, I think you said Metroidvania there, which I guess kind of like you come back to this central area several times with new bits of equipment which kind of excavate new layers of it. So there are certain interactive elements you can only use when you've got certain bits of equipment. So there's always a reason to return to it in theory. I'd pretty liken it more to the Tomb Raider reboots is what it reminded me of.
Yeah. Like
very key-based. It's not like you don't get any abilities that kind of change your perception of this space, but it does recycle the space and sort of find new things to do with it. I think you're right. Most of that happens in the first half of the game. You know, you sort of start off in the village and then you do something else and you kind of come back to the village. But I felt like after that second trip, I'd really seen like 90% of what they were going to do with it. There's a couple of extra bits you can kind of pick off a bit later. But I did like that side of it. I liked the idea of this space that you kind of came back to. It would kind of repopulate with different enemies. So there were like different combat challenges when you returned. I think they could have easily had another trip to it. And that maybe would have like changed the pace of the second half a bit more. I will say I don't actually have the same problems with you in terms of the 2 halves. For my money, I felt like this was basically a big old kind of greatest hits of Resident Evil, and there are different stretches of the game that feel like different games. I actually enjoyed kind of all of them pretty much. So I didn't really have as big a beef with the second half. Like I've seen this line a lot, that the second half is like very weak or too actiony or whatever, but there's a lot of action in the first half, and I quite like the action. I much prefer the action in this than I did in Resident Evil 7. I think this is a decent action game from start to finish that occasionally goes full-on horror in a very effective way.
Yeah, like...
Come on, exploding werewolves' heads is fun.
I prefer the survival horror aspects of this video game.
Yeah.
But I also enjoy smashing werewolves' heads open with a shotgun.
You get to do a lot of that in the second half.
Yes, no, you 100% do. All fear is just sucked out of it.
It's not a scary game. I think it's a really entertaining... there was only one section, which won't spoil, which I think where it goes like out and out horror game, and it is really, it's quite effective. But outside of that, it is actually more like Resident Evil 4. It's like entertaining. It's just entertaining, gooey headshots. It's quite easy. I will say on like normal, I don't think I died at all in like regular combat, but I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the kind of silliness of it. For me, like Resident Evil it can be very, very silly, and it has been very silly in the past. And like for me, this ticked a lot of that silliness boxes. And I feel like how people feel about this game as a whole might depend on their appetite for like the sillier element of Resident Evil. Like I like Resident Evil 6, for example, which a lot of people are like super down on. This is definitely more coherent than 6, but it has a similar kind of like, oh, what mad bullshit are they doing next? Where 7 was a bit better behaved in that regard. Like 7 felt like a kind of conscious effort to be like tonally kind of more coherent for the whole thing, I think.
It goes a little bit too power fantasy for me.
Yeah.
You have that shotgun I mentioned. You have like a grenade launcher. You have magnums. You're a killing machine. And at one point I had something like over 200 pistol bullets.
Yeah.
The ammo is so plentiful that I know I said, the whole sense of fear is sort of gone, but even just tension. Because though at the beginning, the firefights with these werewolves that are like shambling towards you, and they're very jittery, so trying to get a shot on them can sometimes be difficult. But they are tense because you might only have a handful of shotgun shells or a clip or two of handgun bullets. But then at the halfway point, you're laying down landmines, you're firing pipe bombs at baddies.
Yeah.
And look, I do get it. Like, Resident Evil has always had weapons in it. It's always had grenade launchers. It's always had playable characters that have had some sort of combat training.
That's where it slipped into just being like a bit of an entertaining romp for me. I was like, oh, okay, it's not scary and it's not really a survival game. Okay, it's not the nicest feeling shooter. It's no like fucking Doom or anything.
Yeah.
But there is a sense of I'm fundamentally enjoying everything. There's a late game area where you spend quite a stretch of time.
Oh, woof.
I see. I liked it. It's self-contained, but it's got like enemies with like big glowing weak spots, which I quite liked fighting. I thought they were quite fun. Yeah, I really don't have the beef with that area that other people seem to have. Didn't you like the shooting the glowing weak spots? Isn't that satisfying?
That was satisfying in that it was something a bit different, yes. But that bit just went on too long. I found the map muddled. That just went on very long, I found.
Well, I don't know. I just had a laugh with it. I don't know if it's because I was just so overpowered at that point and I was just churning towards it. I'm not going to say the second half is as strong or enjoyable as some of the stuff. I think the castle in the first half and the bit after the castle is really, and the village visit in between is probably the high point of the game. I just don't think it plummets the way that some people suggest it does.
Do you think that, and I suppose, listen, I'm not calling for tank controls to come back. For the love of God, of course I'm not. But, because somebody may say, well, Resident Evil has always had grenade launchers, has always had these things. But the tank controls sort of worked with that because it made firing your handgun awkward. Whereas here, and again, yes, you said, it's not Doom, it's not whatever, but it feels too slick.
Yeah. It didn't feel too slick for me because I was just enjoying. It was like a good level of power. I was enjoying being kind of powerful in that way. I will say, like, one thing I really liked about it was that I think it's a very polished game. Like, I think it's released in a really good state. Like, I didn't have any like tech problems with it. I think it shows you a lot. I think it's kind of relentlessly paced. On paper, it's much bigger than 7. It took me about 10 hours to get through it. And that was kind of taking my time with backtracking and everything. I feel like I kind of really milked the world for everything it was worth. I wouldn't say there's a huge amount of fat. I mean, you obviously don't like that last area as much, but I think it like whips you between a lot of locations. And like, kudos to Capcom for this. I think they actually held back a lot of what is in the game. They focused a lot of their marketing on like the village and the giant vampire lady.
Of course.
When actually that probably accounts for the first quarter of the game, I'd say. It's weird. I thought I'd miss her, but I actually kind of liked the other kind of big villains of it enough that I didn't really mind. I thought they're very different, and they've got, that's what's interesting about the game is that like each of the big 4 bosses kind of has their own like stretch of the game, which has quite different tone to it, which is the thing I sort of enjoyed.
But we're talking about the big lady, and we mentioned about the village, and there's a bit of back and forth thing. There's some light puzzling in the village as well. You have a tool, you have a key, you go back. Dimitrescu's castle is probably the only other area where you get that a bit. It's similar to the police department or the mansion in that, you'll pick up a key and you'll now be able to open this door and get in this passageway and do this puzzle and so on and so forth. I really enjoyed the castle. I kind of lump that in with the village because it feels like it has the same sort of feeling about it.
She sort of serves a similar role as Mr. X in the Resident Evil 2 remake, where she's kind of patrolling the castle.
Does she? Because I was trying to figure out, is she Mr. X from Resident Evil 2 remake or is she Nemesis from Resident Evil 3?
I think she's, for a stretch of it, she's straight up Mr. X. But that's the telling thing, that you couldn't really sense that, I think, is an indicator that it's either not as effective or it's a trick that only really works once.
Yeah. Because
Mr. X, when it happens and you realise, oh shit, he can come through doors now, it's like really, really scary. Here, I was like, oh, okay, I've got this. The castle is built on a couple of looping kind of layouts, so it's quite easy to kind of like get behind her and get her out the way. She is scripted for quite a chunk of it, and it's quite effective because like she's this sort of presence without you having any direct interaction. But once it kind of kicks off proper, yeah, she is basically like roaming the central bit of the castle. It didn't really work as well for me. But I think they happened upon some like amazing like alchemy with Mr. X. Here, like I feel like they've got to stop doing that now. Like they've actually already exhausted it after 2 games.
Yeah.
But like it's still, this is the thing, even if it's not particularly scary, it's still entertaining to have like the big, and she's getting like increasingly cross with you because of other stuff you're doing in the castle, and that's quite fun.
Like there is some tension when you're hearing her clip-clopping around in her heels.
Yeah.
The peak for me, I mean, I say the peak for me, I'd imagine the peak for you, I'd imagine the peak for a lot of people, is the second area. Everyone raving about Dimitrescu? Pah, it's all about Angie. It is, by quite a margin, the best part of the game. It feels like a modern survival game. It feels like something from, say, Frictional Games' catalogue. It feels like a survival horror in 2021.
It is good. I think it is especially effective, though, because it is a self-contained segment. I think if the whole game is that, I wouldn't want to play it because it would just be too stressful and too intense. I think it kind of says for like an hour or an hour and a half or whatever, we're going to be like a proper scary, a bit more like some of the effective bits in Resident Evil 7. Like I actually think the opening of Resident Evil 7 is pretty scary and pretty full on. And it kind of has more of that vibe.
It's claustrophobic. Like, as you said, it's all in one area. So there's a great atmosphere. It's expertly done because you're just constantly on edge, despite the fact that the place isn't overrun by werewolves or anything like that. Do you know what? It's like, do you know, with Dimitrescu walking around her place? And there is some tension sometimes, yeah, but you know you're safe other times. In the second area, I felt always on edge. I thought something was always going to do something nasty to me.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Yeah, I still stand by the fact that I'm glad it was like one strand of the game rather than a more substantial thing. I think it could have outstayed its welcome, or if they'd tried to kind of repeat a similar set piece like a bit later in the game, it might not have worked. I mean, I think it's unfortunate that kind of put next to that what follows maybe seems slightly weaker. Though I think the stuff at the lake is absolutely fine as a change of pace. The game's never boring, you've got to say that for it.
Yeah.
That's no small achievement. That's reasonably hard to make a consistently kind of evolving, moving thing.
I do, to your point, I do think Angie's bit, you can't do that for 12 hours.
No, I know, like you can't. I personally wouldn't want to play that game. Like for me, it's more of like it's tapping more into what they're doing with like Outlast or something, which is something I can only really stomach for like an hour and a half before it's just, I don't have any enjoyment of being that sort of highly strung for that long. But here, for them to kind of, put on the foot of the gas, it's very disciplined for them to like keep it as short as they do, really.
One thing we haven't spoken about yet, Matthew, the story. Oh, I can't tell whether it's a masterpiece or an utter shambles, because it's not trying to be funny, but this is hilarious at points. And yeah, I'm not going to go into spoiling story or anything like that, but like, I don't know, do you think it's campy or do you think it's shoddy? What is it in your opinion?
I think it's campy as hell. I think this is like, I think Resident Evil has had this like strand to it before. It's behaved like this before. It's gone like big, silly. The problem with it is that Ethan Winters at the heart of it is a terrible character. I mean, there's nothing to him. He's a really miserable man, and he has the wildest adventure of like any protagonist. Like some of the shit he goes through in this game, like the punishment his hands take is just, it's absolutely laughable. Like there's a scene, we won't spoil it, in the castle where something happens to one of his hands that it really did make me burst out laughing at how dumb it was, and particularly how like totally like nonchalant he was about what happened to him. I think the villains are really good fun. You may not enjoy fighting all of them equally or what they do with all of them equally, but I think there's a bit quite early on in the game where it foreshadows what's going to come, sort of basically introduces you to the kind of the villainous cast of the game. And I actually think it's a really great scene because you're like, oh, okay, like, what's all this about? Like this, I thought this was just going to be like a big vampire lady and werewolves, but there's a bit more kind of going on in the game, kind of variety-wise, than they've let on in like the marketing or whatever. I quite like the Heisenberg character.
Yeah. Like
as a big campy villain, I thought it was fun, and I liked the boss fight with him, which we won't go into.
God, that made me laugh. There are Like, there's one part in particular that I'd love to explain. I think I text you it. Of course I can't say it because it's proper spoilers. But that part, I was pissing myself. And I was like, am I meant to be pissing myself here? I don't think I am. That's where I struggle with the, like, yes, I think some parts are campy. But I do think some parts they veer into shoddiness as well. It walks a very fine line.
It expects you to have a deeper emotional connection to Ethan Winters than anyone could possibly be expected to have. And he's just a 3D character model that bits get chopped off occasionally, and I really don't care for the guy. I will say, whatever the content of the story, I think it does have momentum. I think you are always intrigued about what's going to happen next. I think it pulls you through the game very effectively. I wanted to see it through just to see exactly where it was going, exactly what it was doing, because there's so much weird shit in that village that doesn't kind of sit together very well. And like the MacGuffins that you're collecting, it's quite odd. I mean, there's the kind of the...
It's very odd, yeah.
You can't really spoil it, but you are like, I am at least intrigued to see what this is going to be. And it probably turns out to be a bit more boring or quite a traditional kind of resi. It'll inevitably end with some big monster. But for the most part, I was always thinking, I wonder what's going to happen next, which I think is actually quite effective, like game making and storytelling in its own way.
Yes, I have my problems with it, but at the same time, I enjoyed playing it. Like I think it's a fun romp.
Yeah.
That isn't going to test you. I mean, the game isn't going to test you much because I don't think it's that difficult. There's plenty of ammo, whatever.
It's difficult on hard. You pop it up one difficulty and it suddenly gets weirdly hard.
It wants you to see it through.
It has that classic Capcom or that classic Resident Evil thing specifically of once you get through, you get all these unlockable, new weapons and things. So you're kind of encouraged to do it again, a bit more tooled up. And I imagine you could run several laps of this, getting increasingly powerful and really like leaning into how daft it is, or doing the very hard difficulty. I mean, there's a big difficulty spike right at the start that I think on anything other than normal is actually like surprisingly brutal.
But yeah, that is the game that we have played over the last week.
Hey, it is a game. It's a AAA romp.
It's good fun. It is good fun.
I've forgotten what it's like to play like a big, expensive, shiny game. It's been a while.
It's, not scary, good fun, shoot the zombie
Scary
werewolf things. Scary in one bit, and that's the best bit.